you're drifting back in time, far before cities rose, far before kings and queens ruled the world, far before history even had words to record itself. Close your eyes and imagine a world where the cold winds of the Ice Age brushed across endless plains, where humans were not alone, where another kind of people walked beside us, strong, mysterious, and deeply human in their own way. Tonight, we're going to sink gently into their world, exploring what life, and even love, might have been like for the Neanderthals. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Picture a landscape that feels both familiar and alien. Thick forests stretch into the horizon, broken by patches of open grassland where herds of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses graze. Snow crunches underfoot, rivers freeze in the winter, and the air is heavy with smoke from fire pits carefully tended by groups of early humans. This was the Ice Age, a time when survival was a daily challenge, and when one of humanity's closest relatives, the Neanderthals, thrived across Europe and parts of Western Asia. The Neanderthals lived tens of thousands of years before written words, but the evidence they left behind, stone tools, bones, hearths, and even traces of their DNA in us, allows us to piece together their story. They weren't monsters, as early stereotypes once suggested, nor were they dumb brutes dragging clubs. They were people, fully human in their own way, though a little different from us. Their bodies were shorter and sturdier, built to withstand the cold. Their rib cages were broad, their muscles thick, their faces strong, with large brow ridges and wide noses that helped them breathe the icy air. Imagine them walking through that frozen world, a group of 10 to 15 individuals, wrapped in furs, stitched with bone needles, children clutching the hands of adults, hunters carrying spears tipped with carefully shaped stone. Their lives were shaped by the land, by the animals they hunted, the caves they sheltered in, and the seasons that dictated hunger or plenty. When we think about their daily existence, it's easy to picture only hardship. Cold winds, gnawing hunger, predators lurking. But Neanderthals were not just surviving, they were living, laughing, caring, and, in their own way, loving. They gathered around firelight, told stories we will never hear, and passed knowledge to their children. They buried their dead, sometimes with flowers, suggesting a sense of ritual and meaning. In every corner of their world, they left subtle signs that life for them was not simply about hunting and hiding. It was also about connection. As you imagine the flickering light of a fire in a cave, smoke curling upwards into the dark, picture Neanderthals sitting close together for warmth. They shared food, they comforted the sick, they watched over their young, and somewhere in that closeness, in that shared struggle, intimacy was born. For the Neanderthals, sex was not separate from life. It was woven into the fabric of survival, companionship, and community. But before we drift into that part of their existence, we must first truly understand their world. A world of constant change, where glaciers advanced and retreated, where valleys filled with ice, and where animals migrated in great herds across the plains. To live as a Neanderthal meant to adapt, to shift with the seasons, to know the patterns of the hunt, to remember which caves offered shelter and which rivers froze too thick to cross. Their societies were small, but within those groups, both NDs were strong. Studies of their remains show healed injuries, meaning that when one of them was hurt, others cared for them until recovery. This sense of compassion suggests a life filled not just with danger but with moments of tenderness. And in those small moments, perhaps around a fire, when food was shared and laughter echoed off cave walls, we begin to glimpse how intimacy and sexuality may have taken shape. Neanderthal life, in many ways, was about balance, between the harshness of their environment and the closeness of their communities. Without one another, survival was nearly impossible. Together, they endured, and through that endurance they passed on their genes, not only within their own kind, but eventually into us. Today, most people outside of Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a genetic whisper from those ancient encounters. To imagine their world fully, slow down your thoughts. Picture a frozen dawn, where the pale sun rises over hills dusted in snow. A child wakes in a cave, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Their mother pulls a fur blanket tighter around them, while hunters ready themselves for the day ahead. The smell of smoke lingers, the fire embers glowing faintly. Outside, the breath of animals hangs in the air like mist. This was the stage upon which Neanderthal life and love unfolded. When we ask what sex was like for Neanderthals, we must first remember that intimacy does not exist in isolation. It is shaped by the world around it. For them, sex was not a concept debated in books or whispered in poetry. It was part of the rhythm of survival, tied to the need for companionship, the continuation of family, and the fleeting joys in a life that was often brutally short. Yet in that brevity there was beauty, a kind of raw humanity that lingers still in our imagination. So, as we settle deeper into this story, breathing slowly, letting the ancient world take shape around us, we remember the Neanderthals were not just shadows of the past. They were people. They lived, they loved, and in their own way, they shaped us. Their world was harsh, yet within it, the Neanderthals were perfectly designed. When we imagine their bodies, we should not see clumsy figures hunched over with vacant eyes, as early artists once depicted them. Instead, imagine powerful forms shaped by ice, wind, and struggle. Their skeletons tell us that they were shorter than most modern humans, with the average man standing about 5'6", and women a little less. But what they lacked in height, they more than made up for in strength. The bones of Neanderthals were thick and dense, wrapped in muscles far more powerful than ours. Their shoulders were broad, their arms robust, their hands capable of gripping stone tools with astonishing force. Their legs were stocky, built for stability across rough terrain. In a world where every step could mean survival or death, they carried themselves like living fortresses. Imagine their footprints pressed into the mud near a riverbank, wide, steady, and certain. These were not fragile beings. They were built to endure, and yet they were not simply muscle and bone. Their skulls, with heavy brow ridges and long, low shapes, housed brains slightly larger on average than our own. Size alone does not equal intelligence, but it tells us something important. Neanderthals were not mindless. They thought, they planned, they remembered, and they taught. They crafted stone blades, fashioned spears, and mastered the control of fire. They knew the seasons of the hunt and the migration of animals. They buried their dead, hinting at beliefs we can only guess at. When you picture a Neanderthal gazing into the flames of a fire, try to imagine the thoughts moving quietly behind those deep-set eyes. They were not so different from us. Perhaps they remembered the hunt that day, replaying moments of triumph or fear. Perhaps they thought of their children, asleep nearby, and of the need to pee. Protect them through the long night. Perhaps they felt affection, grief, longing. All the signs suggest they were capable of these emotions, even if they expressed them differently. Their faces were not like ours, but they were expressive in their own way. The wide nose that helped them breathe cold air might have flared in anger or softened in laughter. Their heavy brows may have shadowed eyes that could glisten with tears or brighten with recognition. Around a fire, one Neanderthal might have leaned close to another, not with words as we know them, but with touch, with gesture, with the unspoken language of closeness. It is in this closeness that intimacy begins to take root. For Neanderthals, the body was not only a tool for survival, it was also a bridge between people. To share warmth, to rest side by side in a cave while the winds howled outside, was not simply a matter of comfort, but of life itself. In those moments, bonds grew strong, and as bonds grew, so too did the possibility of affection, of partnership, of sex that was not merely mechanical but connected to companionship. We must pause here and think about the role of the mind. Sex for Neanderthals, as for us, was not only about the body. It was tied to emotion, to memory, to imagination. Their larger brains suggest that they had the capacity for complex social relationships. They lived in groups, relied on one another, and cared for the injured. From this, we can infer that intimacy had meaning beyond reproduction. It may have reinforced trust, reduced conflict, and strengthened the ties that bound the group together. Their minds also carried them into realms we struggle to glimpse. Did they dream of spirits? Did they imagine stories of the hunt, or of the world beyond the mountains? Did they think of life and death, of what lay beyond? We know they sometimes buried their dead carefully, and in some sites, flowers have been found among the remains. Whether those flowers were deliberately placed or not, the very possibility suggests something profound, that Neanderthals had the capacity for symbolic thought. If they could mourn, they could love. If they could love, then sex for them may have carried not only the weight of instinct, but the richness of emotion. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. A Neanderthal man returns from the hunt, muscles aching, his fur cloak heavy with the scent of smoke. He enters the cave where firelight glows, and his partner is there, perhaps grinding roots into a meal, perhaps nursing a child. Their eyes meet, no words are spoken, or at least none that we would understand, but in that glance lies recognition, safety, belonging, the simple joy of returning to someone who matters. When night deepens and the fire burns low, they lie close, their bodies pressed together for warmth. For them, intimacy was not a luxury. It was woven into survival. To share warmth was to share life. And in that closeness, the act of sex was both natural and necessary, a rhythm of life, a quiet continuation of bonds that held their small society together. Think again of their bodies, strong, powerful, yet capable of tenderness. Their hands, which could strike sparks from flint or bring down a bison, could also touch with gentleness. Their eyes, which scanned the horizon for predators, could soften in moments of affection. For all their differences, they were still human, still capable of desire, of longing, of closeness that went beyond instinct. As we drift deeper into their story, it becomes clear that to understand Neanderthal sex is not to isolate a single act, but to see it within the whole of their being. Their bodies gave them strength, their minds gave them meaning, and together, these shaped a kind of humanity that, though different from ours, was no less real. So, as the Ice Age winds whistle softly outside the cave of memory, we step gently into their world. We see their bodies in motion, their minds at work, their hearts quietly beating, with the same ancient rhythm that still lingers within us today. If you want to truly understand intimacy among the Neanderthals, you must first step into the circle of their lives, into the rhythm of their families and the bonds that held them together. For these were not solitary beings wandering alone across the frozen plains. They lived in groups, small bands of perhaps 10, 20, sometimes 30 individuals. Each band was a tiny world, a fragile but enduring community bound by ties of blood, companionship, and survival. Imagine the entrance of a limestone cave in the fading light of day. Inside, the fire flickers against the walls, throwing shifting shadows on rough stone. Around it, you would see not strangers, but kin. A grandmother, her body weathered from years of cold winters, passing down skills to the younger women. A father carving a spearhead from flint, his child watching closely, learning through patient imitation. A teenager practicing with a smaller spear, eager to prove himself on the hunt. And nearby, a baby rests in its mother's arms, lulled to sleep by the steady rhythm of voices and fire crackle. For the Neanderthals, this was life. Small, intimate communities where everyone depended on one another. Their bonds were not luxuries. They were the very foundation of survival. Without the group, the individual could not last. Together, they could endure. The evidence we find in their bones tells us stories of compassion and care. Some skeletons reveal individuals who had suffered severe injuries, broken limbs, crippling arthritis, even blindness. And yet, these people lived on for many years after their injuries. That could only have happened if others cared for them, fed them, sheltered them, and protected them. It is in that care that we glimpse the deep bonds of Neanderthal families. Now imagine the day-to-day rhythm of such a group. In the mornings, hunters might set out with spears in hand, tracking the movements of bison or deer across the plains. Those who remained tended the fire, prepared hides for clothing, and looked after the child. Young, children learned not in schools, but through watching, listening, and imitating. Around them stories would be told, not in written words, for they had none, but in gestures, in shared memory, perhaps even in spoken language, though simpler than ours. Every moment reinforced the web of connection, and woven into that web was affection. Not only the affection between mates, but the affection between siblings, between parents and children, between elders and the young. Life was hard, but it was also tender. The Neanderthals sang lullabies we will never hear, told bedtime stories in voices lost to time, and comforted one another through storms and hunger. In those gestures, the foundation of intimacy grew strong. When we ask what sex was like for Neanderthals, we must first see it within this framework. For them, intimacy was not simply an act between two individuals. It was part of the wider fabric of family and society. A bond between mates strengthened the group, ensured the survival of children, and stabilized the small, fragile community. Consider for a moment the role of partnership. A male and female Neanderthal, paired in a lifelong bond, or perhaps a bond that lasted only a season, would share in the burdens of life. He might bring back meat from the hunt, while she prepared clothing to keep the group warm. Together, they would raise children, nurture them, and watch them grow into hunters and gatherers of their own. Sex, then, was not only about desire, it was also about reinforcing trust, companionship, and cooperation. The children of such unions were not raised alone. In these small groups, everyone played a role. Older siblings watched the younger ones. Grandparents passed on knowledge of plants and animals, of weather and shelter. Cousins, aunts, and uncles all contributed to the care of the young. In such an environment, intimacy was not hidden away, or abstracted. It was simply a natural part of life, woven into the cycle of birth, growth, and renewal. Now let us step closer to the fire again, watching as the evening settles in. The hunters return, weary but alive. They share meat with the group, and laughter rises as stories of the hunt are told with sweeping gestures. The children mimic the movements, pretending to chase invisible prey. In this moment, the entire band is bound together, each member leaning into the warmth of the fire and the warmth of one another. When night falls fully and the cold presses close, pairs might withdraw into furs, pressing their bodies together for heat. Some may find comfort in companionship, in a partner who eases the loneliness of the long winter nights. For Neanderthals, sex was not an isolated event, but part of a cycle of closeness, comfort, and the continuation of life. The tenderness we see in their family structures reminds us that they were not simply hunters surviving on instinct. They were beings of emotion, of connection. They cared, they nurtured, they remembered, they understood in their own way what it meant to belong to one another. And as we drift further into their world, we begin to see how these bonds shaped every part of their existence. From the way they hunted and ate, to the way they grieved, to the way they loved. For the Neanderthals, family was not just blood, it was survival, it was warmth in the cold, it was the space where intimacy found its home. If we lean closer to the Neanderthals' lives, past the flicker of firelight and the steady rhythm of daily survival, a question stirs gently in the background. How did attraction begin for them? What drew one Neanderthal to another in a world without poetry, without written words, without songs carved into paper? Attraction, for them, was not dressed in courtship rituals like those of medieval knights or Victorian lovers. Instead, it was simpler, quieter, woven into the fabric of survival and the rhythms of community. Imagine a young Neanderthal standing by a river, watching the older hunters prepare their spears. The way someone carried themselves, the strength of their movements, the skill in their hands, would not go unnoticed. Attraction was not a matter of painted faces or elaborate garments. It was about capability. Who could provide food? Who could care for children? Who could protect the group when danger came crawling out of the shadows? These were the silent markers of desirability. But even in a world of survival, we should not strip away the softer threads of humanity. Just as today we might notice a smile, a glance, or the warmth in someone's voice, so too might the Neanderthals have noticed. Their bodies may have been different, their speech perhaps simpler, but they were still human. When eyes met across the glow of a fire, something wordless may have passed between them, a spark of familiarity, a sense of connection. Courtship, if we can call it that, may have been woven into acts of care, sharing food, offering warmth, sitting close during long winter nights. For us, flowers might symbolize affection. For them, it might have been the offering of a piece of meat from the hunt, or the gesture of wrapping a fur cloak around another's shoulders. Attraction was less about display, and more about the quiet assurance that one's presence brought safety and strength. The Neanderthals lived in small groups, and so potential partners were few. This meant that pairing was deeply significant. Bonds were not easily replaced, and once formed, they may have lasted for many years, perhaps even for life. Such pairings were more than personal choices, they were the threads that bound the group together. A strong bond between two individuals meant stability for their children, stability for the group. And yet, within these pairings, there may have been tenderness. Archaeological evidence shows us that Neanderthals cared for their young, nurtured the sick, and remembered their dead. If they had such capacity for compassion, it is not a stretch to imagine affection in their intimate bonds as well. A touch of reassurance during a storm, a hand resting on another's shoulder after a difficult hunt, a glance that carried more meaning than any spoken word. Their bodies, too, carried signs of attraction. Neanderthal men and women alike were strong, their muscles shaped by constant movement. Their faces, with their broad noses and heavy brows, may not look familiar to us, but to one another they were the markers of kinship and beauty. In their own eyes, their features would not have been strange. They were simply human. And within that recognition, attraction grew naturally, just as it does among us. It is worth remembering that intimacy is not only physical, it is also emotional, social, and spiritual. For Neanderthals, to pair with someone was to share the burdens of survival, the gathering of food, the raising of children, the tending of fires, the enduring of winters. Through such sharing, bonds deepened, and attraction blossomed into partnership. Picture again the group gathered in a cave on a winter night. The wind howls outside, snow piling against the rocks. Inside, the fire glows, and the air is filled with the smell of roasted meat. A man sits down beside a woman, offering her a portion of food. She accepts, their hands brushing briefly. In that moment, something unspoken passes between them. A recognition, a warmth. Over time, they will hunt together, share furs, and raise children side by side. But in this single gesture, the bond begins. We might call it love. They might not have had a word for it, but they knew its weight all the same. For love is not always spoken. Sometimes it lives in gestures, in presence, in the simple act of staying close. And in the world of the Neanderthals, where life was fragile and every tomorrow uncertain, such bonds carried even greater meaning. So when we wonder what sex was like for Neanderthals, we must see it not as an isolated act, but as part of this greater dance of attraction and pairing. It was the continuation of bonds, the sealing of companionship, the promise of survival carried forward through touch and closeness. It was not a matter of romance as we know it, but of something even more primal and enduring, the instinct to connect, to belong, to share life's burdens together. As we move deeper into their story, we carry with us this understanding that even in the frozen silence of the Ice Age, hearts still stirred, bonds still formed, and attraction still lit the fire of intimacy. To truly understand intimacy among the Neanderthals, we must place it against the backdrop of their world, a world where survival was never guaranteed, where the earth itself seemed to press hard against every breath and every heartbeat. Sexuality for them was not separate from this environment. It was shaped, molded, and bound by the harsh realities of the Ice Age. Imagine the endless cold of winter pressing against the walls of a cave. The fire burns, but its glow only stretches so far. Outside, snow swirls across the open plains, burying tracks of mammoths and wolves alike. In such a world, intimacy was not only about desire, it was about warmth, closeness, and the continuation of life. Bodies pressed together in the darkness were not only seeking pleasure, but shelter from the biting cold. The harshness of the climate meant that every life was precious. Mortality rates were high, children did not always survive infancy, and adults often lived only into their 30s. In such conditions, sexuality took on an urgency. It was the bridge to the next generation, the fragile thread that kept a community alive. Without it, the group risked vanishing into the snow. And so, intimacy was not a pastime, not something separate from daily life. It was survival itself. But survival did not mean that intimacy was stripped of tenderness. On the contrary, it matters. You've made closeness even more meaningful. To share one's body in a world that could be cruel was to share hope, to affirm life in the face of death. Each act of union was a reminder that tomorrow could still be carried forward, that bloodlines would continue, that the group's story would not end. Think of the daily struggles, hunting enormous beasts, tending fires that might sputter out in the night, guarding children against predators that lurked just beyond the glow of camp. These struggles weighed heavily, and yet within them, intimacy offered a release, a return to safety. In the act of closeness, Neanderthals may have found not only warmth but comfort, reassurance that they were not alone in a dangerous world. We often picture survival in cold terms: spears, fires, food, shelter. But survival is also emotional. To endure harsh environments, humans need bonds, connections, and reasons to keep fighting through the next storm. Sexuality, for Neanderthals, may have been part of that deeper emotional survival. It was not only about producing children, but about binding people together, giving them strength to face the freezing winds. Their world was not a gentle one. Prey fought back, predators struck suddenly, winters froze crops and rivers alike, injuries were common, hunger never far away. And yet, in this world, Neanderthals continued to live, to form families, to share companionship. This persistence tells us that their sexuality was resilient, adaptable, able to find expression, even in the face of hardship. Picture again the cave at night. A woman cradles her child, humming softly as embers glow faintly in the center of the chamber. Beside her, her partner tends the fire, glancing over with quiet affection. Outside, the storm rages, but inside there is warmth, closeness, and the pulse of life continuing. Later, when the child is asleep, the couple draws closer, bodies pressed together under furs, seeking both warmth and the reassurance of touch. It is a moment of vulnerability, but also of strength, the act of intimacy against the relentless cold. Even the cycles of nature shaped their sexuality. Seasons dictated abundance and scarcity. During times of plenty, when hunts were successful and food was secure, intimacy may have been more frequent, more relaxed. During famine or sickness, closeness may have become more cautious, driven by necessity rather than leisure. But through it all, sexuality endured, because without it, the group itself could not endure. And there is something deeply human in this endurance. For even in the harshest environments, intimacy finds a way. It adapts, it bends, it persists. It is as much a part of survival as fire and water. For the Neanderthals, it was no different. Against the roar of winter winds, against the shadows of predators, against the weight of hunger, they still found time to love, to bond, to continue the fragile dance of life. When we think of their sexuality, we must not strip it of its humanity. It was not purely instinct, not only mechanical reproduction. It was a thread of connection woven through the fabric of survival. It was a reminder, each time, that they were not alone in their struggle, that even in the coldest nights, someone was there beside them. So, as we let the fire crackle in our imagination and the Ice Age winds howl softly in the distance, we remember this truth. Sexuality for Neanderthals was never separate from their environment. It was shaped by the cold, sharpened by survival, softened by care, and carried forward as the most human of instincts, the instinct to connect, to endure, to live. If we step deeper into the lives of Neanderthals, past the bones and stone tools, past the caves and hunting grounds, we find something even more telling about who they were, their capacity for care. This is where intimacy expands beyond the act itself and becomes something larger, something that speaks to the very heart of humanity, love, kinship, and the bow. NDS that held them together. Archaeologists have discovered skeletons of Neanderthals who lived with injuries and illnesses that would have made survival nearly impossible without the help of others. One famous find revealed an individual who had lost the use of one arm, suffered from partial blindness, and endured serious injuries long before death. And yet this person lived for many years. How? Because others must have provided food, protection, and comfort. They were not abandoned. They were not left behind. They were cared for. This kind of care speaks to a world where relationships extended beyond utility. To help another meant to value them, to see them as part of a family, a group, a shared existence. And within these bonds of care, we glimpse what intimacy may have looked like for Neanderthals. It was not fleeting, not empty, but rooted in lasting connections, nurtured by loyalty and affection. Imagine a small group traveling across rocky terrain. The hunters return, tired but carrying the day's kill. The women and children gather close, not only to share the food, but to share in the triumph of survival. Later, when the fires are lit, laughter echoes softly in the cave. Children tumble in play, elders tell stories, and partners sit close, exchanging looks that speak more than words. In such moments, intimacy was not hidden or shameful. It was part of the fabric of kinship, woven into the rhythm of daily life. The idea of love is often thought of as modern, shaped by poetry, literature, and culture. But the roots of love are far older than written words. Love, in its simplest form, is care. It is the choice to remain beside someone, to comfort them when they are weak, to protect them when danger threatens. In this sense, Neanderthals loved. Their care for the injured, their tenderness toward children, their bonds within small groups. All of this reveals a form of love as old as humanity itself. And when we turn to intimacy, to sexuality, it becomes clear that it, too, was entwined with these bonds. To lie beside someone at night, to share warmth and tucker. Was not only an act of survival, it was an act of closeness, of reassurance. Each embrace carried the weight of kinship, the reminder that life was not lived alone. In a harsh world, this bond was perhaps the greatest comfort one could have. Raising children deepened this web of kinship. A Neanderthal child was fragile, just like any human child. They required years of care, constant watchfulness, steady provision of food and protection. This was not something a single parent could provide alone. It required the group, the family, the clan. In this shared responsibility, intimacy between partners extended into parenthood, binding them even closer. Each child became a living symbol of their union, a reminder of continuity in a world where life was often cut short. Kinship also meant teaching, passing down skills, sharing knowledge of plants, animals, tools, and the rhythms of the land. A father guiding his child's hands as they shape a stone tool, a mother showing her daughter how to prepare roots, an elder recounting stories of hunts long past. All of this was intimacy of another kind. It was not physical, but it was binding. It was the act of carrying one's essence into the future. Even death did not sever these bonds easily. We know that some Neanderthals buried their dead, covering them gently in soil, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with objects that may have held meaning. To bury the dead is not an instinct of survival. It is an act of memory, of love, of kinship that extends beyond life itself. It is the silent whisper, you mattered, you belonged, you will not be forgotten. And so, when we think of Neanderthal intimacy, we must not imagine it as cold or primitive. Instead, it was layered with meaning. Their sexuality was one thread in a wider fabric of kinship, care, and love. Each touch, each act of closeness was part of a larger story, the story of B. Longing. Picture, for a moment, a quiet evening thousands of years ago. The fire burns low, casting golden light across the walls of a cave. A man, scarred from the hunt, leans back as his partner tends a wound with gentle hands. Their child sleeps nearby, curled under furs. Outside, wolves cry into the night, but inside there is calm, there is warmth, there is love. It is not the love of poems or songs, but it is love all the same. Enduring, steadfast, profoundly human. Love, care, and kinship were not luxuries for Neanderthals. They were the foundations of survival, the bonds that carried them through storms, hunger, and time itself. And in their embrace of these bonds, we see ourselves reflected, for we too are carried by love. It is the oldest inheritance we share. The story of Neanderthals cannot be told without eventually bringing in their cousins, us. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals walked the earth not alone, but alongside other human species. And of all these encounters, none mattered more than the one with Homo sapiens, the ancestors of modern humans. Picture the scene. The Ice Age landscape stretching wide and unforgiving, glaciers carving deep valleys, forests clinging to life in sheltered pockets, plains where herds of animals roamed under the constant threat of predators. Into this world came the Neanderthals, already at home, already adapted to the cold, their heavy bodies strong, their hands skilled with stone tools. And then slowly another figure appeared, leaner, more gracile, carrying new tools, new techniques, new ways of being. This was us, Homo sapiens. At first, the two groups may have eyed one another from a distance. The Neanderthals, stocky and powerful, with broad brows and sturdy frames. The sapiens, with narrower builds, faces more like those we recognize in the mirror today. They were different, and yet, at the same time, deeply alike. Both hunted, both gathered, both cared for their young, both carried the spark of humanity in their eyes. The meeting of Neanderthals and sapiens was not a single event but a series of encounters stretched over millennia. In caves, in valleys, by riversides, the two species crossed paths. Sometimes these encounters may have been tense, even violent. Competition for food, territory, and resources could not have been avoided. The Ice Age did not offer abundance. Every herd of animals mattered. Every stretch of land could mean the difference between survival and starvation. And yet, not all encounters were marked by conflict. For in time, something remarkable happened. The two groups interbred. We know this not because of speculation, but because of science. Modern genetics has revealed that most people alive today carry small traces of Neanderthal DNA within them. These fragments are whispers of encounters long past, proof that Neanderthals and sapiens did not live entirely apart. They came together, they formed bonds, they shared intimacy. What did these encounters look like? We can only imagine. Perhaps a group of sapiens arrived in a valley where Neanderthals already lived. At first, the two groups kept their distance, wary of one another's presence. But as seasons passed, exchanges may have taken place. Food, knowledge, companionship. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, bonds may have formed between individuals, bonds strong enough to cross the divide of species. It is tempting to think of these unions as rare, as unusual, but the genetic evidence suggests they were not so uncommon. Time and again, across Europe and Asia, sapiens and Neanderthals came together, leaving their mark in DNA that still lingers thousands of years later. Of course, these encounters were shaped by their environments. Life was not easy for either group. Harsh winters demanded cooperation, and sometimes, joining together may have been a matter of survival. A sapiens woman and a Neanderthal man, or vice versa, might have found in each other not only companions, but protection, a way to secure the future in uncertain times. And yet, there was something more than necessity. To form such unions meant that attraction crossed species lines. It meant that, at some level, Neanderthals and sapiens saw each other not as other, but as potential partners, as beings capable of closeness, of intimacy, of love. This mingling of lives is extraordinary when we pause to reflect on it. We are so accustomed to thinking of Neanderthals as distant, as separate, as gone. But in truth, they are not gone. They live within us, in the genes that shape our immune systems, in the fragments of DNA that influence our skin, our hair, even our moods. We are not merely sapiens, we are part Neanderthal. The line between us and them has never been as sharp as it may seem. For Neanderthals, these encounters must have been transformative. To meet another species so much like themselves, and yet so different, was perhaps bewildering. And for sapiens, the same would have been true. But in the end, what mattered was not the difference, but the closeness. In the quiet spaces of life, around fires, in shelters, under the same endless stars. The two groups found common ground. This interbreeding did not erase Neanderthals immediately. For thousands of years they continued to live, to hunt, to love. But slowly, as climates shifted and sapiens spread further, Neanderthals dwindled. By around 40,000 years ago they were gone as a distinct people. And yet they were not gone entirely, because we carry them within us. Every heartbeat we feel, every breath we take, carries faint echoes of those unions, of those moments when sapiens and Neanderthals became one. So when we think of Neanderthal intimacy, we cannot forget this part of the story. It was not only within their own groups, it was shared across species, carried into the present through our very blood. And in this way, the intimacy of Neanderthals did not end with them. It continues still, quietly, in each of us. When we close our eyes and think of Neanderthals, it's tempting to imagine them as distant, as if they belonged to another world, cut off from ours by time and extinction. But the truth is more intimate, more immediate. They are not simply shadowing in the caves of prehistory. They are part of us. They are written into our very being, etched into the double helix of our DNA. Modern science has made this connection visible. By sequencing ancient bones, researchers have revealed that Neanderthals are not gone, not completely. Their genes live on inside us. For people of non-African descent, between 1 and 2% of their DNA comes directly from Neanderthals. In some individuals, the percentage is even higher. And for populations in Asia, traces are even more pronounced, suggesting multiple waves of interbreeding across thousands of years. This means that every time you look into the mirror, every time you trace the lines of your own face, you may be looking at faint echoes of Neanderthal ancestry. It might show itself in the shape of your nose, in the way your immune system responds to illness, in the density of your bones, or in subtler ways we are only beginning to understand. Neanderthals are not lost to the past. They linger in the present, hidden in plain sight, carried quietly within us. But these genetic legacies are not just curiosities of science. They tell a deeper story about intimacy, connection, and survival. When Neanderthals and Homo sapiens came together, they did more than share moments of companionship. They braided their lineages together, intertwining destinies that remain linked even now. Without those unions, humanity today would look different, live differently, perhaps even struggle more. Some Neanderthal genes strengthened us. They gave sapiens resistance to new environments, sharpened immune responses, and adapted bodies to colder climates. Other genes carried risks, tendencies toward certain conditions, vulnerabilities. As hidden within the code, intimacy between Neanderthals and sapiens was not without its costs, but it ensured that parts of both lineages survived, long after one vanished from the earth. Think of it this way: Neanderthals may have disappeared as a separate people, but they did not vanish entirely. They live on as whispers inside our DNA, as ancient signatures that still shape who we are. In this sense, their intimacy was a gift to the future. Each union, each bond, each act of closeness was a thread woven into a tapestry that would stretch beyond their time, reaching into ours. It is strange to consider that we are, all of us, hybrids, not purely sapiens, not purely Neanderthal, but something in between. We carry with us not only their physical traits, but perhaps also echoes of their emotions, their rhythms of life, their ways of bonding. Science cannot yet tell us everything, but we know enough to say this: the Neanderthals did not die out entirely. They continue in us. And so, when you feel a sudden resilience in the cold, when your immune system fights a sickness with unexpected strength, when you notice features that feel older than time, you may be feeling their presence. A reminder that you are not alone in your lineage, that deep within you, stretching back across tens of thousands of years, is the pulse of Neanderthal life. This is the legacy of their intimacy, the quiet inheritance of love, care, and union across species. It is not something written in books or etched in stone. It is written in us. We are the living record of Neanderthal closeness, the proof that their story did not end in the caves of Europe. It continues in every breath we take. When we speak of Neanderthals, it is easy to cloak them in distance. We imagine them as shadows against cave walls, as bones beneath the earth, as curiosities dug up by archaeologists with brushes and chisels. But if we pause, if we listen carefully to what the evidence whispers, we begin to see something much more familiar. We begin to see ourselves. Neanderthals were not beasts. They were not mindless or rude. They were human in ways that matter most. They formed families. They raised children. They cared for the wounded. They buried their dead. They sang, perhaps softly, around fires. They watched the stars, the same stars that we see tonight, and wondered what lay beyond them. In all of these acts, their humanity shines, undeniable and clear. And within that humanity, intimacy found its place. to touch another, to bond, to create life together. These were not alien acts. They were deeply human, echoes of the same drives that carry us even now. Sexuality for them was not something separate from who they were. It was woven into the fabric of existence, tied to survival, to tenderness, to love. When we picture a Neanderthal couple drawing close on a cold night, or a parent soothing a child by the fire, we see not strangers, but kin. We see the very beginnings of the bonds that define us. Every gentle gesture, every act of care, every choice to stay beside one another in the face of hardship, all of it was humanity in its purest form. It is tempting to judge them through the lens of modern life, to imagine them as primitive, lacking, incomplete. But that is not the truth. The truth is quieter and perhaps more beautiful. They were human in ways we cannot fully measure, carrying wisdom and emotions that will forever remain partly hidden. Yet enough remains for us to know this. They loved, they suffered, they hoped, and in that they were no different from us. Their humanity is not erased by extinction. It lingers in the traces they left behind. In their tools, in their bones, in the faint genetic echoes within our blood. It lingers in the way we reflect upon them, wondering, dreaming, seeing ourselves mirrored in their story. And perhaps this is their greatest gift to us. They remind us that humanity is not defined by cities or writing or technology. It is defined by connection, by care, by intimacy and kinship, by the choice to reach out to another, to endure together, to keep life moving forward against the cold winds of time. So when we think of Neanderthals, we need not think of them as other. We may instead think of them as brothers, sisters, cousins in the long family of humankind. Their story is not a story apart from ours. It is our story too. Close your eyes for a moment and let yourself drift back once more into the world we've been walking through together. A world of firelight and stone, of wind and snow, of caves echoing with voices long since gone. The Neanderthals lived there, not as myths, not as creatures, but as people. Real people, breathing, laughing, suffering, loving. People who felt the sharp bite of cold against their skin, who knew hunger and relief, who understood tenderness in ways both familiar and mysterious. Now, as we stand here in the present, separated by 40,000 years, we may wonder what remains of them. Their bones lie silent beneath layers of earth, their tools rest in glass museum cases, their presence traced by archaeologists with careful hands. And yet, they are not gone. Their story lingers in our blood, their memory in our reflections, their essence in the questions that stir as we look back toward the deep past. This is the closing chapter, the soft descent into quiet, but it is not a chapter of endings. It is a chapter of remembering, of honoring, of holding close the fragile thread that ties us to them. When we think of history, we often imagine kings and empires, battles and conquests, great walls and monuments of stone. But history is not only written in such grand strokes. It is also written in the quiet, in the intimate, in the bonds that held people together when the world was unforgiving. The Neanderthals remind us of this truth. Their lives were not marked by palaces or crowns. Their lives were marked by fires shared, by food passed from hand to hand, by embraces that kept the cold away, by children born and nurtured with patience. Their monuments were not towering, of stone, but the warmth of touch, the closeness of kin, the choice to stay together when the winds howled outside. And so, as the centuries passed, their story folded itself into ours. Each breath we take today carries the faintest trace of theirs. Each heartbeat echoes, however quietly, with the same rhythm that once pulsed in their chests. The breath of time does not erase. It transforms, it carries forward, it reshapes, but it never fully forgets. We began this journey by asking a simple question: what was sex really like for Neanderthals? But as the story unfolded, we discovered that intimacy for them was far more than an act. It was survival, yes, it was reproduction, of course, but it was also comfort, resilience, and love. Think of the way a mother must have cradled her child in the crook of her arm, soothing the small cries in the dark. Think of a wounded hunter returning to the shelter, greeted not with abandonment but with care. Think of a partner's hand resting lightly against another's shoulder as firelight flickered across the stone walls. These small moments of touch, gentle, grounding, human, were intimacy. And when Neanderthals drew close to one another in the act of sex, it was not only a joining of bodies, but of lives. It was a chance to affirm their belonging, to create something lasting, to carry hope into the uncertain future. The tenderness within that act is not lost to us. It exists still, because it is the same tenderness that lingers in us today. Then came sapiens, our kind, walking across the plains, crossing rivers, entering valleys where Neanderthals had lived for millennia. At first there must have been hesitation, wariness, perhaps even hostility. And yet, in the midst of difference, attraction bloomed, bonds formed, children were born who carried the blood of both. This was not simply the meeting of two species, it was the meeting of two ways of life, two rhythms of survival, two branches of the human family tree, and through intimacy, those branches entwined. Through closeness, the divide was crossed. Even now, in the quiet chambers of our DNA, the memory of those unions remains. We are living proof that the intimacy between Neanderthals and sapiens was real, was lasting, was world-shaping. Without it, we would not be the same people we are today. But perhaps the most moving part of the Neanderthal story lies not in their encounters with us, but in the way they treated one another. Their skeletons tell tales of care, individuals living for years despite grave injuries, elders carried through the harshness of winter, children nurtured with food and protection. These were not acts of instinct alone, they were acts of love. Imagine a group of Neanderthals traveling across snow-covered ground, carrying with them an elder whose legs had grown too weak to walk. Each step slowed them down, each mile more dangerous because of the burden, and yet they carried on. They did not abandon their own. Or picture a young woman whose arm was shattered in a fall. She could no longer hunt or forage, and yet she lived for years afterward, cared for by her companions, fed by their hunts, sheltered by their strength. This is what intimacy meant to Neanderthals, not merely sex, not merely survival, but the choice to stay, to protect, to love. As we drift closer to the end of this reflection, let us pause and think of what lingers. Neanderthals are with us still, not only in DNA, but in the ways we live, the ways we bond, the ways we love. When you hold someone's hand, when you care for a sick relative, when you comfort a crying child, you are reenacting the same intimate acts that Neanderthals once performed in caves lit by flickering fire. They are not so far away as we might think. 40,000 years may sound like an endless gulf, but in the rhythm of human history, it is only a breath. Only a handful of generations separate us from them. Their story is not closed, not finished. It continues in us. What leagued us on do the Neanderthals leave us? Perhaps it is this. Humanity is not defined by monuments or machines. It is defined by care, by kinship, by the choice to reach across the cold and say, "You are not alone." The intimacy of Neanderthals teaches us that love is ancient, that tenderness is as old as humanity itself, that even in the hardest of worlds, closeness endures. When we look back at them, we see not a people lost, but a people who remind us of what truly matters. We see that to be human is to be vulnerable, to seek comfort in another, to build a family, to leave behind something that carries forward. And so, as our story comes to a close, let us settle into stillness. Imagine the cave one last time, the embers glowing red, the walls painted with flickers of light and shadow. The Neanderthals are there. A family gathered, a child breathing softly in sleep, a pair of lovers resting in each other's arms, an elder murmuring quiet words into the night. Outside, the snow falls endlessly. But inside, there is warmth, there is intimacy, there is life. This is their legacy, not extinction, but love, not disappearance, but continuity, not silence, but echoes that still live in us. So as you drift deeper into calm, remember this. You are not only human in the modern sense, you are also Neanderthal. You carry their tenderness, their resilience, their closeness within you. Their story is your story, and it will carry on as long as we do. Let that thought rest with you now, like a blanket pulled gently around your shoulders. The fire is low, the night is long, but you are not alone. You never have been. Not now, not 40,000 years ago. The human story has always been shared. And with that, the echoes fade, and you may close your eyes, knowing that somewhere, deep in your very being, the Neanderthals still live.